Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need when you've given up hope of getting anything at all. At 53, Runa had buried more friends than she cared to count and figured her fighting days were behind her. When her uncle died and left her his old trading hall, she expected nothing more than a leaky roof and fading memories. The place had been empty for years. The great stone fireplace was clogged with debris and hadn't seen a flame in decades. But while cleaning out that cold hearth, something strange happened. The stones gave way under her touch, revealing a hidden tunnel that led deep into the mountain. What she found at the end changed everything. Would this discovery bring her the peace she'd been searching for, or drag her into one last battle? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain valley of Eriksfjord had always been a place where time moved differently. Ancient pine trees stretched toward granite peaks that caught the first light of dawn and held it like cupped hands, warming the settlement below. The trading hall sat at the valley's heart, where three mountain paths converged, one leading north to the coastal ports, another east toward the great forests, and the third winding south through passes that connected to distant kingdoms. Runa Eriksdottir stood before the weathered timber structure, her calloused hands resting on the iron keyring her uncle had left her. The keys were heavy, blackened with age, and worn smooth by decades of use. Each one told a story she didn't yet understand. The largest opened the main hall's oak doors, their carved dragon heads now faded and chipped. Smaller keys controlled storage rooms, private chambers, and the strongbox where Bjorn had kept his most precious records. The trading hall itself spoke of better times. 2 stories of hewn logs and stone, with a steep-pitched roof designed to shed the heavy mountain snows. Wide windows faced each direction, allowing merchants to watch for approaching caravans while conducting their business inside. The main floor had once housed the great trading room, where furs, amber, silver, and exotic goods from distant lands changed hands. Above, private quarters provided lodging for traveling merchants and Bjorn's own family. But that family was gone now. Bjorn's wife had died of fever 15 winters past. Their son had sailed west with the Greenland expeditions and never returned. One by one, the rooms had emptied, the trading partnerships had dissolved, and the hall had fallen into the quiet decay that comes when purpose departs. Runa pushed open the main door, its hinges protesting with a groan that echoed through the empty chamber. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, streaming through dirty windows. The air smelled of old timber, cold ashes, and something else, the faint scent of herbs and spices that had permeated the wood over decades of trade. Even abandoned, the hall held memories in its very bones. She had not seen this place in over 20 years. Not since the bitter argument that had driven her from Bjorn's table and into the shield wall of distant wars. He had called her reckless, hungry for glory at any cost. She had called him a coward, content to count coins while braver souls bled for honor. Both had spoken truths that cut deep, and neither had possessed the wisdom to heal what their pride had broken. Now Bjorn lay in the village cemetery, and Runa carried scars from battles she could barely remember. The fierce young woman who had stormed from this hall in righteous anger had died in pieces over the years, a cut here, a friend lost there, until what remained was someone older, wearier, and perhaps finally wise enough to understand what her uncle had tried to tell her. The great hearth dominated the hall's far wall, built from stones hauled down from the high peaks. It was massive enough to warm the entire main floor, with iron hooks for cooking pots and a wide mantel carved with protective runes. But now it stood cold and choked with debris, years of leaves blown down the chimney, bird nests, and the accumulated dust of abandonment. Runa set her travel pack on the nearest table and approached the fireplace. This would be her first task, before anything else. A hall without a warm hearth was no home at all, just another empty building waiting for time to claim it entirely. She had learned practical skills during her years of war, how to make camp in hostile territory, how to find clean water, how to coax fire from wet wood when life depended on it. These mundane abilities had served her better than any sword technique when the fighting finally ended and she found herself alone in an uncaring world. The village of Eriksfjord had grown smaller in her absence, as mountain settlements often did when the young departed for easier lives in coastal towns. Perhaps 24 families remained, most of them elders who remembered her as Bjorn's headstrong niece. They had welcomed her return with the careful courtesy accorded to familiar strangers, polite enough, but wary of what changes she might bring to their quiet routines. Henrik the blacksmith had helped her transport her few possessions from the village, a man of perhaps 60 winters, with silver threading his brown beard and hands scarred by decades at the forge. He had known Bjorn well, had done business with him for 30 years, and his careful questions suggested he understood more about the trading hall's secrets than he initially revealed. "Your uncle was a cautious man in his later years," Henrik had said while unloading her chest of belongings. "Careful about who he trusted, careful about what he shared. Some said he grew suspicious with age, but I think he simply learned to value discretion." Astrid the healer had brought bread and honey as a welcoming gift. A woman of Runa's own age, with the keen eyes and gentle manner of someone who had spent decades tending others' wounds and sorrows. Her knowledge of herbs and old remedies was legendary throughout the valley, and she possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from being indispensable to a community's survival. "Bjorn spoke of you often," Astrid had said, settling into a chair by the empty hearth. "Especially in his final months, he carried guilt about your quarrel, you know. Used to say he had been too proud to admit when he was wrong." Young Olaf, though at 25, he was hardly young by most standards, served as the village's unofficial messenger and chronicler. Quick-witted and curious, he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local families, histories, and legends. He had been the one to bring news of Bjorn's death to Runa's distant dwelling, riding 3 days through mountain passes to deliver the message personally. "The hall has been waiting for you," Olaf had told her during that first visit. "Henrik keeps the roof patched, Astrid tends the herb garden, but we all knew it needed family to bring it back to life. These people had been Bjorn's neighbors and friends, and now they would be hers if she chose to stay." The prospect of belonging somewhere again felt both appealing and terrifying. She had grown accustomed to solitude, to moving on when relationships became complicated. Putting down roots meant accepting responsibility for more than just her own survival. The trading ledger lay open on Bjorn's old desk, its leather binding cracked but still serviceable. Page after page recorded decades of transactions: furs from the northern trappers, amber from coastal gatherers, silver jewelry crafted by local artisans, and exotic goods from distant lands. The entries revealed a network of relationships spanning half the known world, built on trust and maintained through careful attention to honor and fairness. Bjorn's handwriting had grown shakier in recent years, but his final entries showed the same meticulous care that had characterized his entire career. The last transaction, recorded just days before his death, involved payment for historical research services, an unusual entry that stood out among the more typical trading records. Runa traced the entry with her finger, wondering what historical research would have interested a retired trader. Bjorn had always been curious about the valley's past, often entertaining visitors with stories of ancient settlements and forgotten kings. Perhaps in his final years, he had decided to investigate some local legend or family history. The afternoon light was fading, and the empty hall felt vast and cold around her. She would need to light a fire soon, both for warmth and to banish the gloom that seemed to press in from the shadows. But first, she needed to clear the debris from the hearth, a task that would likely take several hours and require all the tools she could find. The building felt different from her childhood memories. Smaller in some ways, but also more substantial, built to last centuries rather than decades. The craftsmanship showed in every joint and beam, the work of builders who had expected their creation to shelter generations of their descendants. It deserved better than to stand empty and forgotten, slowly surrendering to weather and time. Runa hefted her war axe, its familiar weight comforting in her hands. The blade had been her companion through countless battles, but tonight it would serve a more peaceful purpose, breaking apart whatever blockages filled the chimney and clearing space for new fires to burn. Sometimes the tools of war could be turned to the work of rebuilding, if one possessed the wisdom to know when fighting should end and healing begin. The work began at first light. Runa had slept poorly on the narrow bed in Bjorn's old chamber, her warrior's instincts keeping her alert to every creak and whisper in the unfamiliar building. The mountain silence felt different from the battlefield quiet. She had known peaceful rather than threatening, but somehow more profound in its implications. She dressed in her oldest tunic and woolen leggings, clothes that could withstand the dirty work ahead. The hearth demanded her attention before anything else could proceed. Without fire, the hall would remain a hollow shell, impressive but lifeless. With warmth and light, it could become a home again. The fireplace opening stood nearly as tall as she was, built to accommodate the massive logs that mountain winters required. But decades of neglect had reduced it to a cave of shadows and debris. Dead leaves rustled in the depths, and something, perhaps a family of mice, scurried away from her approaching footsteps. Runa lit an oil lamp and peered into the darkness. The blockage was worse than she had expected. Years of autumn storms had blown countless leaves down the chimney, creating a dense mat that trapped moisture and allowed decay to set in. Bird nests added to the tangle, some recent, others so old they had become part of the general mess. She began with her hands, pulling out the loose material from the opening. The work was grimy and uncomfortable, requiring her to crouch in the fireplace itself while debris showered down on her head and shoulders. Her back ached from the awkward position, and dust made her eyes water, but she pressed forward with the methodical patience that years of hard living had taught her. Deeper in the chimney, the blockage became more stubborn. Compressed layers of organic matter had formed an almost solid barrier, heavy with trapped moisture and resistant to her efforts to dislodge it. She would need tools, perhaps the iron poker she had seen among Bjorn's fireplace implements, or even her axe if the obstruction proved particularly stubborn. The poker helped, but progress remained slow. Each section she cleared seemed to reveal another layer beneath, as if the chimney had been collecting debris for decades rather than the few years since Bjorn's death. The lamp flickered in the confined space, casting dancing shadows that made her work even more difficult. It was while reaching for a particularly stubborn tangle near the back of the fireplace that her fingers encountered something unexpected. Where she had expected rough stone, she found smooth mortar, but mortar that gave slightly under pressure, as if the joints had been deliberately weakened or damaged. Runa paused, holding the lamp closer to examine what she had discovered. The rear wall of the fireplace consisted of carefully fitted stones, each one shaped to match its neighbors in the traditional manner. But several stones near the bottom showed signs of disturbance. The mortar around them was newer than the rest, lighter in color and different in texture. Curious now, she pressed harder against one of the suspicious stones. It shifted perceptibly, rocking in its setting like a loose tooth. She worked her fingers around its edges, feeling for the extent of the disturbance. 3 stones in the bottom course seemed to have been removed and reset, creating a section perhaps 2 feet wide and 1 foot high. The poker made an effective prying tool. She worked it into the joints around the loose stones, applying steady pressure rather than sudden force. Her experience with siege work had taught her that patience often succeeded where violence failed. Stone walls had their own logic and rhythm. Push too hard too fast, and they would resist, work with their natural weaknesses, and they would eventually yield. The first stone came free with a grinding sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Behind it lay not another layer of masonry, but empty darkness. Cool air flowed out of the opening, carrying scents that had nothing to do with the chimney's accumulated debris, earth and stone, with undertones of something older and more mysterious. Runa's pulse quickened. This was no accidental gap in the construction. Someone had deliberately created this opening, then concealed it behind loose stones that could be removed by anyone who knew the secret. The careful workmanship suggested planning and purpose rather than casual hiding. The second stone proved easier to remove once the first was gone. The third followed readily, leaving an opening large enough for a person to crawl through if they were determined enough. The cool air continued to flow from the darkness beyond, suggesting a substantial space rather than a simple cavity in the wall. She held the lamp to the opening and peered inside. The light revealed a narrow passage carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. The work was ancient, but skillful walls smoothed and fitted with precision, floor level and dry despite the passage of centuries. This was no crude tunnel, hastily excavated for temporary concealment. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in creating a permanent access route to whatever lay beyond. The passage stretched away from the fireplace into darkness that swallowed her lamp's feeble glow. From what she could see, it maintained the same careful construction throughout its length, with fitted stone walls and a level floor that showed signs of regular use in ages past. Whoever had built this had intended it to last. Runa sat back on her heels, lamp in hand, considering what she had discovered. The opening was clearly old. The stonework matched the hall's original construction, suggesting it had been planned from the beginning rather than added later. But Bjorn had never mentioned any hidden passages or secret chambers. If he had known about this, why had he kept it to himself? The possibility that her uncle had been unaware of the passage seemed unlikely. He had lived in this hall for most of his adult life, had maintained and repaired every aspect of its construction. A careful man like Bjorn would have investigated any unusual features, would have known every stone and timber in his property, which meant he had known about the passage and chosen not to share that knowledge. The question was, why? What lay at the other end of that carefully constructed tunnel that required such secrecy? And why had he left the concealment intact when he could have sealed it permanently or revealed it to the village? The afternoon light streaming through the hall's windows reminded her that she had been working for hours. Her back ached from the cramped position, her clothes were filthy with soot and debris, and she needed food and rest before attempting any exploration. But the passage called to her with a pull she recognized from her warrior days, the irresistible urge to know what lay beyond the next hill, around the next bend, through the next door. She carefully replaced the 3 stones, fitting them back into their positions with the same care their original builder had used. The concealment was expert from a casual glance. The rear wall of the fireplace looked entirely normal. Only someone cleaning the chimney as thoroughly as she had been would likely notice the subtle differences in the mortar. That evening, she walked to the village to purchase supplies, and she hoped to learn something about the hall's history without revealing her discovery. Henrik was closing his smithy for the day, banking his fires and securing his tools with the methodical care of a craftsman who respected his equipment. "Working on the hearth today," she mentioned casually. "Amazing how much debris can accumulate in just a few years." Henrik nodded, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "Your uncle kept most things in good repair, but the fireplace troubled him in his later years. Said it didn't draw properly anymore, though I never could find anything wrong with the chimney when I checked it. Perhaps something deeper in the construction," Runa suggested. "Old buildings sometimes develop problems that aren't immediately obvious." The blacksmith's expression grew thoughtful. "Bjorn did ask me about stonework once, about whether old mortar could be weakened deliberately without obvious damage. Said he was curious about building techniques, but now I wonder if he had something specific in mind." Astrid proved equally intriguing when Runa stopped to purchase herbs for cooking. The healer listened to casual questions about the hall's history with the sharp attention of someone who understood that important information often came disguised as idle conversation. "The hall is older than most people realize," Astrid said, measuring dried rosemary into a cloth pouch. "Built on foundations that go back much further than Bjorn's family line. Some say the original builders chose this spot for reasons that had nothing to do with trading convenience. What sort of reasons? Runa asked. Astrid's smile held secrets, the kind that old women whisper about when they think no one is listening. Tales of ancient kings and hidden treasures, of oaths sworn in darkness, and promises that bind the dead as well as the living. That night, Runa lay awake, listening to the mountain wind and thinking about passages carved in stone, about uncles who kept secrets, and about the strange magnetic pull of mysteries that demanded solving. Tomorrow, she would need to decide whether to explore what lay beyond that hidden opening, or to replace the stones permanently and pretend she had never found them. But in her heart, she already knew the choice was made. Some doors, once discovered, could never remain unopened. Dawn brought resolve along with the pale mountain light. Runa had spent the night wrestling with uncertainty, but morning clarity settled the matter. The passage existed, it beckoned, and she would answer that call. Years of warfare had taught her that postponing dangerous decisions only made them more perilous. She prepared methodically, gathering supplies with the same care she had once used before battle. Oil lamps, extra fuel, rope, her eating knife, and a small hammer from Bjorn's tool collection. The passage appeared stable, but mountain stone could be treacherous. Better to carry more than needed than to find herself trapped in darkness. The concealing stones came away more easily the second time, revealing the tunnel entrance like a doorway to another world. Cool air flowed steadily from the depths, carrying scents of earth and age that spoke of spaces long undisturbed. She lit her lamp and stepped through the opening, leaving the familiar world of the trading hall behind. The passage maintained its careful construction for perhaps 20 paces before opening into a wider chamber carved from the mountain's heart. Here, the work showed even greater sophistication: walls smoothed to perfection, ceiling arched to distribute weight, floor fitted with stones worn smooth by ancient footsteps. This was no rough tunnel hastily excavated for concealment, but architecture worthy of kings. Runa held her lamp high, studying the chamber's dimensions, large enough to hold a dozen people comfortably, with alcoves cut into the walls that might once have held supplies or ceremonial items. The air remained fresh despite the enclosed space, suggesting ventilation shafts too narrow to see, but sufficient to prevent suffocation. A second passage led deeper into the mountain, descending at a gentle angle that made walking easy despite the darkness. Someone had planned this route for regular use, considering the comfort and safety of those who would travel it. The walls showed tool marks from skilled masons, and occasional carved symbols that might have served as waymarks for travelers in the dark. The descent continued for what felt like hundreds of paces, though distance became difficult to judge in the lamp's limited circle of light. The temperature remained constant, cool, but not cold, as if the mountain's mass protected this space from seasonal variations. Her footsteps echoed softly, the sound absorbed by stone that had known silence for uncounted years. Then the passage opened into something that took her breath away. The vault stretched beyond her lamp's reach, a chamber so vast that her light barely touched the distant walls. The ceiling arched high above, supported by natural columns of stone that someone had carved with intricate patterns. But it was what filled the chamber that made her stop and stare in wonder. Gold caught her lamplight and threw it back in gleaming reflections. Coins, jewelry, ornaments, and artifacts arranged in careful piles throughout the space. Not the random accumulation of a miser's hoard, but the organized treasury of a kingdom. Each collection had been arranged with purpose, sorted by type and origin, labeled with wooden markers bearing runic inscriptions. Runa approached the nearest pile with the reverence due to something sacred. The coins bore the images of kings she recognized from childhood stories, rulers of the old kingdoms who had lived centuries before her birth. Among them lay jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, torques of twisted gold, arm rings set with amber, brooches displaying the intricate animal patterns favored by master artisans. One piece drew her attention above all others. A golden neck ring, thick as her thumb, bearing the carved image of a raven and the runic inscription, Harald Rex. King Harald, not the recent Danish ruler, but the legendary Harald Bluetooth, whose kingdom had united the Norse lands before falling to treachery and war. She lifted the torque carefully, feeling its substantial weight. The gold was pure, untarnished by age, worked with a skill that few modern craftsmen could match. The raven symbol marked it as a royal gift, the sort of treasure a king would bestow on his most trusted followers. To find it here, hidden in a mountain vault, suggested stories that histories had forgotten. Other piles revealed similar wonders. Silver arm rings by the dozens, each one representing wealth enough to buy a farm. Amber pieces the size of eggs, some containing insects preserved from ancient forests. Weapons with golden hilts and jeweled scabbards. Drinking horns bound with precious metals and carved with scenes of legendary heroes. But the treasure represented more than mere wealth. This was history made tangible, the physical remnants of a civilization that had vanished into legend. Each piece told stories of craftsmanship, trade, conquest, and culture. Someone had gathered these artifacts not just for their value, but for their significance to the Norse heritage. Runa moved through the chamber like a pilgrim in a sacred space, her lamp revealing new wonders with each step. Here, a collection of royal regalia that might once have crowned forgotten kings. There, a pile of trade goods from distant lands, silk from the east, spices from the south, ivory from places she could not imagine. The vault represented connections spanning the known world, assembled by someone with power and vision to match their ambition. At the chamber's far end, she found what might have been the most significant discovery of all. A stone table held scrolls of vellum, their surfaces covered with detailed maps and written accounts. The ink had faded but remained legible, documenting trade routes, political alliances, and military campaigns from an age when Norse influence stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. One scroll particularly caught her attention. It bore the same royal seal as the golden torque, and its text described the establishment of this very vault. King Harald, sensing the approach of enemies who would destroy his kingdom, had ordered his greatest treasures hidden in a secure location known only to a select few. The vault was meant to preserve not just wealth, but the tools and knowledge needed to rebuild Norse civilization after the coming darkness. The responsibility outlined in the scroll made her hands tremble. This was not just a treasure hoard to be claimed by whoever found it. It was a sacred trust, established by royal command and blessed by ancient oaths. The gold and silver were merely the visible portion of a greater inheritance, the means to restore a fallen culture and honor the memory of those who had died defending it. Footsteps in the passage behind her broke the vault's ancient silence. Runa spun toward the sound, her warrior instincts flaring to life. Someone else knew about this place, had followed her into the depths, and was now approaching through the darkness. Her hand went instinctively to her knife hilt as she prepared to defend both herself and the treasures she had discovered. A familiar voice called out, echoing off the stone walls. "Runa, are you down there?" I saw the lamplight from the passage entrance. Einar emerged from the shadows, his weathered face grave in the flickering light. The village's oldest resident, a man whose white beard and stooped shoulders spoke of 8 decades of mountain winters. But his eyes held an alertness that belied his age, and his presence here suggested knowledge he had not previously shared. "So you found it," he said, surveying the chamber with satisfaction rather than surprise. "Bjorn said you would, when the time was right. Said you had the curiosity and the courage to see past the obvious and discover what lay beneath." Runa lowered her knife, but did not sheath it entirely. "You knew about this place. You knew what was hidden here." Einar nodded slowly. "I have been a guardian of this secret for 60 years, as my father was before me and his father before him. We have waited through generations for someone worthy to inherit the responsibility that comes with such knowledge." The old man's words carried implications that made the treasure suddenly feel less like a blessing and more like a burden. She had thought herself alone with this discovery, free to make her own choices about what to do with it. But Einar's presence suggested a larger story, one that involved oaths and obligations she did not yet understand. Einar moved through the vault with the familiarity of long acquaintance, his lamp adding its glow to the golden reflections that danced across the stone walls. He paused before a particular alcove, one Runa had not yet explored, and beckoned her to join him. "There are things you must understand before you decide what to do with this discovery," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "This treasure comes with obligations that have bound my family for generations. Now those obligations pass to you, whether you choose to accept them or not." The alcove contained a single stone tablet, its surface covered with runic inscriptions, carved deep enough to survive centuries of time. The work showed the same careful craftsmanship as the vault itself, each symbol precisely formed and arranged in lines that spoke of formal ceremony rather than casual record-keeping. "The oath stone," Einar explained, running his fingers along the carved text. "King Harald's final command to those who would guard his legacy. Read it carefully, for these words have governed our actions since the day this vault was sealed." Runa held her lamp close to the tablet, struggling to decipher runes whose style predated her own education. The language was formal, archaic, but gradually the meaning became clear. Harald, facing the collapse of his kingdom, had entrusted his greatest treasures to a select group of guardians. Their task was not merely to hide the wealth, but to preserve it for a specific purpose, the eventual restoration of Norse unity and culture. The oath bound the guardians and their descendants to secrecy until the proper time arrived. They were to watch for signs that the scattered Norse peoples were ready to reunite, to rebuild what had been lost to war and treachery. Only then could the vault be opened, its contents used to fund the great work of restoration. "How long have you known about this place?" Runa asked, stepping back from the tablet. Einar's smile held both sadness and pride. "My grandfather brought me here when I reached my 20th year, as his grandfather had done for him. Each generation has produced one guardian, sworn to secrecy, trained to recognize the signs that would indicate the proper time for revelation." The old man moved to another section of the vault, where wooden chests lined the walls in careful rows. He opened one to reveal not gold or silver, but documents, maps, treaties, genealogical records, and detailed accounts of Norse settlements throughout the known world. "Harald was a visionary as well as a king," Einar continued. "He understood that rebuilding a civilization required more than wealth. It needed knowledge, connections, legitimate claims to authority. These records document the bloodlines of royal houses, the locations of Norse settlements from Iceland to Russia, the trade routes that once connected our people across vast distances." Runa examined the documents with growing amazement. The scope of information was staggering, detailed maps of territories she had never heard of, records of alliances that had shaped the political landscape for centuries, genealogies that traced noble families back to the earliest kings. This was not just a treasure vault, but a comprehensive archive of Norse civilization. "Bjorn knew all of this," she said, beginning to understand her uncle's strange behavior in his final years. "He was the previous guardian," Einar confirmed. "Chosen by my father 40 years ago, sworn to the same oaths that now bind you. But Bjorn had no children, no obvious heir to carry the responsibility forward. He spent his last years searching for someone worthy of the trust." The weight of revelation settled on Runa's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Her uncle's distance, his careful questions during her rare visits, his apparent obsession with family history in his later years, all of it made sense now. He had been evaluating her, testing her character, determining whether she possessed the wisdom and integrity to inherit this monumental responsibility. "Why me?" she asked. "I am a warrior, not a scholar or a politician. I know nothing of statecraft or the subtle arts of rebuilding kingdoms." Einar's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps that is exactly why Bjorn chose you. A scholar might become lost in the details, paralyzed by the complexity of the task. A politician might use the treasure for personal advancement rather than the greater good. But a warrior understands duty, honor, and the cost of difficult decisions. They spent the next hour exploring the vault's deeper chambers, each one revealing new aspects of Harold's grand design. One room contained weapons and armor, masterpieces of smithcraft meant to equip the leaders of a restored kingdom. Another held regalia and ceremonial items, the symbols of authority that would legitimize new rulers in the eyes of their subjects. A third chamber shocked Runa with its contents. Instead of treasure, it held the mummified remains of a dozen men and women, each one dressed in the finest clothing and jewelry. Their faces, preserved by the mountain's dry air, showed the noble features of the highborn. The original guardians, Einar explained solemnly. When they realized that Harold's restoration would not come in their lifetimes, they chose to join their king in death rather than abandon their posts. Their spirits are said to watch over this place, ensuring that only the worthy may claim its treasures. The sight of those ancient faces, still bearing expressions of dignity and purpose after centuries of death, reminded Runa of the sacred nature of what she had discovered. This was not merely wealth to be claimed, but a trust that had cost lives to establish and preserve. As they prepared to leave the vault, Einar shared one final revelation. Word of your discovery will spread, whether we wish it or not. The village has eyes and ears, and strangers have been asking questions about Bjorn's property. You must decide quickly what course to take, for soon the choice may be taken from your hands. What strangers? Runa asked, her warrior instincts sharpening. A man from the southern kingdoms, claiming to be a merchant interested in old trading routes. But merchants do not usually travel with armed companions, nor do they ask such specific questions about family histories and local legends. They emerged from the passage into the familiar warmth of the trading hall, but the normal world felt different now. The comfortable chamber that had sheltered her uncle's quiet life now served as the entrance to a treasure that could reshape the Norse world. The responsibility was overwhelming, the implications staggering. Einar paused at the concealed entrance, watching as Runa carefully replaced the stones that hid the passage. Your uncle left detailed instructions about what should be done if the proper time arrived, but the final decision rests with you, as the inheritor of his guardianship. Choose wisely, for the consequences will echo through generations. That evening, as Runa sat by her newly restored fire, she found herself studying Bjorn's trading ledger with new understanding. The careful records, the detailed notes about customers and suppliers, the network of relationships spanning vast distances, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Her uncle had spent decades building the connections and gathering the knowledge that would be needed when the vault's treasures were finally revealed. The burden of choice weighed heavily on her shoulders. She could seal the passage forever, living out her remaining years in comfortable obscurity. She could claim the treasure for herself, using it to purchase a life of ease and luxury. Or she could honor the ancient oath, using Harold's legacy to attempt something that had seemed impossible for centuries, the restoration of Norse unity and culture. But first, she needed to understand more about these strangers who had been asking questions. If enemies were already circling, her time for quiet contemplation might be running short. The strangers arrived 3 days later, as the first autumn snow dusted the mountain peaks with white. Runa watched from her window as 5 riders approached the trading hall, their horses bearing the dust of long travel, and their gear suggesting men accustomed to more than merchants' work. The leader rode a black stallion that spoke of considerable expense, its saddle and bridle decorated with silver fittings that caught the morning light. The man himself appeared to be in his middle years, well-dressed but practical, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His companions were younger, harder-looking, with the alert watchfulness of professional soldiers. Runa set down her morning bread and moved to greet them, but not before slipping her knife into her belt and noting the position of her axe near the door. Old habits died hard, and something about these visitors set her teeth on edge. "Good morning," the leader called out as he dismounted. "I am Magnus Thornson from the southern trading cities. I seek the owner of this establishment." His manner was polite but presumptuous, the tone of someone accustomed to having doors opened and questions answered. Runa studied his face, noting the intelligent eyes and the small scar that marked his left cheek, not the sort of mark a merchant typically acquired. "I am Runa Eriksdottir," she replied, remaining in her doorway rather than inviting them inside. "This was my uncle's hall. How may I help you?" Magnus approached with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I am researching the old trading routes through these mountains, particularly those used during the time of King Harold. Your uncle was mentioned as someone knowledgeable about local history." "Bjorn has been dead these 3 months," Runa said flatly. "Whatever knowledge he possessed went with him to the grave. Perhaps, but buildings often hold memories as surely as people do." Magnus gestured toward the hall with proprietorial familiarity. Old trading posts like this one were often chosen for reasons beyond mere convenience. Sometimes they marked the intersections of routes that served purposes beyond simple commerce. The conversation felt like a dance between opponents, each testing the other's knowledge and intentions. Runa kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced through implications. How much did this man know? What had brought him here so soon after her discovery? "Henrik the blacksmith knows more about local history than I do," she offered. "Perhaps he could answer your questions." Magnus shook his head. "I have already spoken with the good smith. He directed me here, saying that your family has maintained this hall for generations. Surely some knowledge has been passed down through the bloodline." One of his companions had dismounted and was studying the hall's exterior with professional interest. His attention lingered on the windows, the doors, the general layout, not the casual observation of a curious traveler, but the systematic evaluation of someone planning for conflict. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" Runa asked, deciding that directness might serve better than evasion. Magnus's smile broadened, revealing teeth that were too perfect for a man of his apparent age. "Historical artifacts, primarily. Objects that might shed light on the trade relationships of Harold's time. There are collectors in the southern cities who pay handsomely for authenticated pieces from that era." The mention of artifacts sent a chill through Runa's bones. This was no casual historian seeking academic knowledge. These men were treasure hunters, and somehow they had learned enough to bring them to her doorstep. "I know of no artifacts," she said carefully. "My uncle dealt in furs and amber, not ancient relics." "Of course not," Magnus agreed, but his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Still, I wonder if I might examine the hall's interior. Old buildings sometimes conceal surprises, and my associates have developed considerable skill in recognizing historical significance." The request crossed a line that Runa would not allow. "The hall is my home now, not a museum. I'm sure you understand a woman's need for privacy." Magnus's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance, quickly masked by renewed courtesy. "Naturally. Perhaps we might discuss this over a meal? My men and I have traveled far, and mountain hospitality has always been legendary." The subtle pressure made Runa's decision easy. "The village inn serves travelers. You'll find it comfortable enough for your needs." She stepped back and began to close the door, but Magnus placed his hand against it with casual force. "Are you certain you cannot spare even a few minutes? I would hate to think that valuable historical knowledge was being overlooked through simple misunderstanding." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Runa felt her warrior instincts flare to life, the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence. Her hand moved toward her knife hilt, a motion that Magnus noted with interest rather than alarm. "Remove your hand from my door," she said quietly. For a moment, the two of them locked eyes, measuring each other's resolve. Then Magnus stepped back with another of his cold smiles. "Forgive my enthusiasm. Historical research can make one overeager." He remounted his horse with fluid grace. We will be staying at the inn for several days, continuing our research. Perhaps you will reconsider once you've had time to think about the mutual benefits of cooperation." The riders departed toward the village, but Runa noticed that one of them lingered, ostensibly adjusting his saddle while actually studying the hall's approaches and potential defensive positions. The man's evaluation was thorough and professional, confirming her suspicions about their true nature. That afternoon, she walked to Henrik's smithy under the pretense of purchasing nails for hall repairs. The blacksmith was hammering out horseshoes, his rhythmic work providing cover for private conversation. "The strangers visited you as well," she said without preamble. Henrik nodded without missing a beat in his hammering. "Yesterday, asked many questions about your uncle, about the hall's history, about local legends. I told them little, but they seemed to know more than they admitted." "What sort of legends interest them particularly?" "The old stories about King Harold's treasure, tales that most people dismiss as fancy, but these men asked very specific questions. They know something, Runa. The question is how much and where they learned it." That evening, Astrid appeared at the hall's door with a basket of herbs and a worried expression. "The strangers have been questioning everyone in the village. They claim to be scholars, but Olaf overheard them discussing weapons and defensive positions when they thought no one was listening." The three of them sat by Runa's fire, sharing bread and trying to make sense of the situation. Somewhere in their discussion, Einar joined them, his arrival so quiet that none of them noticed until he spoke from the shadows. "They are descendants of the original betrayers," he said simply. "The families who broke their oaths to King Harold and caused his kingdom's fall. They have spent generations searching for the treasure they helped to hide, driven by guilt and greed in equal measure." The old man moved into the firelight, his face grave with knowledge that had waited decades for revelation. Magnus Thornson's ancestor was Thorkel the Betrayer, one of Harold's trusted jarls who sold his loyalty for silver. The family has never forgotten the shame of their treason nor the knowledge of what they helped to conceal. Runa felt the pieces falling into place. They know about the vault. They know it exists, but not its location. For centuries, they have searched, following legends and family stories, buying information from anyone who might possess knowledge. Your uncle's death and your inheritance finally brought them here. The implications were staggering. The treasure that was meant to restore Norse civilization was being hunted by the very bloodline that had destroyed it originally. The irony was bitter, but the danger was immediate and real. "What do they want?" Astrid asked. Einar's expression grew darker. "What they have always wanted, to claim the treasure for themselves, to use Harold's legacy to wash away their family's shame. They believe that possessing the hoard will somehow redeem their ancestors' betrayal." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hall shutters with a sound like distant warfare. The strangers were in the village now, asking questions, gathering information, preparing for whatever action they intended to take. Time was running short for quiet decisions and careful planning. Runa stood and moved to the window, studying the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, enemies were planning their next move. The treasure that had remained hidden for centuries was about to become the center of a conflict that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of Harold's sacred legacy. The peaceful retirement she had hoped to find in her uncle's hall was slipping away, replaced by the familiar weight of impending battle. But this time, she would not be fighting for gold or glory. This time, she would be defending something far more precious, the dreams of a dead king and the hopes of a scattered people who might yet find their way home. The attack came at dawn, not with swords and axes, but with law and documents. Magnus appeared at the hall's door, accompanied by two men in the robes of royal officials, their presence lending legitimacy to what would otherwise be simple banditry. "Good morning, Runa Eriksdottir," Magnus said with false courtesy. "I bring greetings from the king's court and documents that require your immediate attention." The taller official unrolled a scroll bearing royal seals and spoke in the formal tones of bureaucratic authority. By order of King Canute, this property is subject to investigation for possible violations of the ancient laws regarding hidden treasure. All structures and grounds must be made available for official examination. Runa examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that legal warfare could be as deadly as the battlefield variety. The seals appeared genuine, the language properly formal, but something felt wrong about the entire proceeding. "These laws you cite," she said slowly. "I am not familiar with their provisions." Magnus stepped forward with practiced smoothness. "Ancient statutes, rarely invoked but still valid. They require that any treasure found on private land be reported to royal authorities for evaluation and taxation. Failure to comply is considered theft from the crown." The second official added his voice to the intimidation. "The penalty for concealing royal treasure is forfeiture of all property and possible imprisonment. However, cooperation with our investigation will be viewed favorably by the court." Behind the legal language lay a trap carefully constructed over months of planning. Magnus had used his connections and resources to manufacture a legitimate-seeming justification for searching the hall. Whether the documents were genuine or forged mattered less than their appearance of authority. "I have found no treasure," Runa said truthfully. "My uncle left me an old building and little else. Nevertheless, the investigation must proceed," Magnus replied. "These officials are empowered to conduct a thorough search of all structures and grounds. Your cooperation is not optional." The situation balanced on a knife's edge. Resisting would confirm their suspicions and provide justification for more aggressive action. Cooperating might reveal the passage, but could also demonstrate innocence if they found nothing obvious. Runa made her choice with the instincts of a veteran warrior. "Very well. Examine what you will, but I expect the search to be conducted with respect for my property and privacy." The officials began their work with professional thoroughness, examining every room, every storage area, every possible hiding place. Magnus supervised with the intensity of a man whose life's obsession was finally within reach. His eyes missed nothing, cataloging details that seemed insignificant but might reveal larger truths. The fireplace received particular attention. The officials noted the recent cleaning, the careful stonework, the unusual depth of the hearth itself. Magnus ran his hands along the walls, tapping stones and listening for hollow sounds that might indicate concealed spaces. Runa watched the examination with outward calm, while her mind raced through contingencies. The concealing stones were perfectly fitted, but Magnus possessed knowledge that could guide his search. How much did he know about the vault's construction? How close would he come to discovering the hidden entrance? "This fireplace shows signs of recent disturbance," one official noted, examining the mortar around the rear stones. "Some stones appear to have been removed and replaced." Magnus knelt beside the hearth, his hands tracing the same paths Runa's had followed days earlier. "The mortar is different here. Newer work, designed to conceal rather than permanently secure." The moment stretched toward crisis as Magnus applied pressure to the suspicious stones. Runa felt her hand drift toward her knife, knowing that discovery would mean battle, whether she was prepared or not. Then Henrik's voice called from outside, accompanied by the sound of approaching horses. "Runa, visitors from the capital!" A new group of riders appeared in the yard, their banners bearing the authentic seals of royal authority. At their head rode a woman whose bearing proclaimed her importance before her escort announced her identity. "Lady Sigrid, royal magistrate, here on official business," the herald declared. "All persons present will submit to royal authority." Magnus rose from the fireplace, his face pale with sudden understanding. The documents he had brought might fool villagers, but they would not survive scrutiny from genuine royal officials. His carefully constructed legal trap was collapsing around him. Lady Sigrid dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Her examination of Magnus's documents was swift and merciless, her verdict delivered with judicial finality. "These warrants are forgeries, skillfully done, but bearing seals that do not match current royal protocols." The officials accompanying you have no authority to conduct searches or seizures." She turned to her guards. "Arrest these men for impersonating royal agents." The confrontation that had threatened to explode into violence dissolved into legal proceedings as Magnus and his companions found themselves bound and facing charges that could cost them their lives. The forged documents that were meant to provide legitimacy became evidence of treason against the crown. But Lady Sigrid's arrival raised new questions that troubled Runa deeply. Royal magistrates did not travel to remote mountain villages without significant cause. Something had brought this woman here at exactly the right moment to prevent Magnus's deception from succeeding. "You seem remarkably well informed about events in our small valley," Runa observed, as the prisoners were secured. Lady Sigrid's smile held secrets worthy of royal courts. "The crown has many interests, some of them quite ancient. When reports reached us of treasure hunters operating under false authority, investigation became necessary. That afternoon, after Magnus and his men had been escorted away under guard, Lady Sigrid requested private conversation with Runa. They walked the mountain paths above the village, speaking carefully about subjects that required discretion. "Your uncle served the crown in ways that were never officially recorded," Lady Sigrid revealed. "His knowledge of ancient trade routes and historical sites made him valuable for certain investigations. His death created a gap in our understanding that his successor must now fill." The implication was clear. Bjorn's guardianship of the vault had been known to royal authorities, perhaps even sanctioned by them. His choice of Runa as heir carried obligations that extended beyond the ancient oaths, to include service to the current kingdom. "What exactly does the crown expect from me?" Runa asked. "Discretion, wisdom, the understanding that some secrets serve purposes larger than individual gain." Lady Sigrid paused at a viewpoint overlooking the valley. "Magnus represents one threat among many. There are others who seek what your uncle protected, some with resources that dwarf his pathetic attempts at legal manipulation." That evening, Einar brought news that completed the picture of their situation. Hidden among Bjorn's papers, he had found correspondence with royal agents dating back decades. The vault's existence was known to a select few within the government, its treasures considered a strategic resource for national emergencies. 1. Your uncle was more than a guardian, Einar explained. He was an agent of the crown, tasked with protecting assets that might someday fund the kingdom's defense against foreign invasion or internal rebellion. The revelation transformed everything. Runa thought she understood about her inheritance. The treasure was not just a historical artifact or a tool for Norse restoration. It was a weapon in the hands of those who controlled it, a source of power that could reshape kingdoms or destroy them. As night fell over the valley, Runa found herself caught between competing loyalties and obligations. The ancient oath to King Harald demanded that the treasure serve the restoration of Norse culture. The royal expectations suggested it should remain available for the current kingdom's needs. Her own desires pointed toward a quiet life, free from such monumental responsibilities. But Magnus's defeat had been temporary, not final. Other treasure hunters would follow, drawn by the same legends and driven by similar obsessions. The vault's secret was spreading beyond the small circle of guardians who had protected it for centuries. Soon, she would need to make choices that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of Harald's legacy and the security of the kingdom that now claimed authority over it. The peaceful retirement she had sought was slipping further away with each passing day, replaced by responsibilities that would test every lesson she had learned in a lifetime of conflict. 3 days after Magnus's arrest, Runa found the letter hidden in her uncle's private chest, concealed beneath a false bottom that she discovered only by accident. The parchment bore Bjorn's careful handwriting, but the contents shattered everything she thought she understood about recent events. "My dear niece," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the first test has been completed successfully. Magnus's arrival was not the threat it appeared to be, but a carefully orchestrated trial of your character and judgment. Runa read the words twice, unable to accept their implications. The attack on the hall, the forged documents, the threat to the vault's secrecy, all of it had been planned by her uncle as some kind of elaborate examination. Magnus Thornson is indeed descended from Harold's betrayers, but his quest for redemption is genuine. For 30 years, he has worked to atone for his ancestors' crimes, serving as an agent for those who guard Harold's legacy. His apparent villainy was a role played at my request, designed to test whether you possess the wisdom and courage needed for the responsibilities ahead. The letter continued with revelations that reframed every interaction of the past week. Lady Sigrid was not just a royal magistrate, but the secret leader of an organization dedicated to preserving and eventually implementing Harold's grand design. The vault beneath the trading hall was one of several such repositories scattered across the Norse lands, each one guarded by families who had maintained their vigil for centuries. "You have proven yourself worthy," Bjorn's letter continued, "but greater challenges await. The treasure you have discovered is indeed vast, but it represents only a fraction of what Harold preserved. The true test comes now, whether you can unite the scattered guardians and restore the kingdom that was lost to treachery and war." Runa set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly. Her uncle had manipulated events from beyond the grave, orchestrating a drama that tested her reactions to threat, responsibility, and moral complexity. Even in death, he had continued to evaluate her fitness for a role she was only beginning to understand. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Magnus stood outside, no longer under guard, his manner subdued but determined. The arrogance and menace he had displayed earlier were gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. "May I enter?" he asked. "There are things I need to explain, apologies I need to make." She admitted him reluctantly, still processing the letter's revelations. The man who had threatened her home and challenged her authority now seemed smaller, more human, burdened by guilt that had shaped his entire life. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," Magnus began, settling into a chair by the fire. "He understood that you would need to see me as an enemy before you could trust me as an ally. The deception was necessary, though I find it harder to bear than I expected. The forged documents, the threats, real enough to convince you, false enough to be easily exposed when the time came." Bjorn arranged every detail, including Lady Sigrid's perfectly timed arrival. Magnus rubbed his face wearily. "I have spent decades searching for ways to redeem my family's betrayal. When Bjorn offered me this chance, I could not refuse, despite the distaste I felt for the deception." The conversation that followed revealed layers of history that stretched back centuries. Magnus's family had indeed betrayed King Harold, but they had spent generations trying to undo the damage they had caused. Some had served as secret guardians, protecting information about the treasure's locations. Others had worked within royal courts and merchant guilds, preparing for the day when restoration might become possible. "Harold's vision was larger than any of us initially understood," Magnus explained. "He did not merely hide his treasure to preserve it. He created a network of guardians, a system of hidden knowledge, a plan for eventual resurrection of Norse unity that could span centuries if necessary." As if summoned by their conversation, Lady Sigrid appeared at the door, accompanied by Einar and several figures Runa did not recognize. Their arrival had the feeling of a planned convergence, another layer of Bjorn's elaborate design finally revealing itself. "The Council of Guardians," Lady Sigrid announced formally, "representatives of the families who have maintained Harold's legacy across the generations. We gather now because the time for secrecy has ended." The newcomers were introduced one by one, each representing a different aspect of Harold's grand design. Eric Ironhand spoke for the weaponsmiths who had preserved the techniques needed to arm a restored kingdom. Ingrid Farwalker represented the merchant networks that still connected Norse communities across vast distances. Thorvald Truthkeeper maintained the genealogical records that could legitimize new rulers and validate ancient claims. Together, they painted a picture of an organization that had operated in shadow for centuries, preparing for a restoration that had seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing generation. The treasures hidden beneath the trading hall were meant to fund this effort, but they were only one component of a far more comprehensive plan. "Your uncle believed that the time had finally come," Lady Sigrid explained. Political instability in the southern kingdoms, renewed interest in Norse heritage among scattered communities, changes in trade routes that favor northern settlements, all signs that the moment for action might be approaching. Einar added his own perspective to the discussion. But Bjorn also understood that success would require leadership from someone untainted by centuries of secret planning. Someone who could see the goal clearly without being burdened by the weight of inherited expectations. The implications were staggering. They wanted her to lead not just the protection of a single treasure vault, but the resurrection of an entire civilization. The scope of responsibility made her previous concerns about Magnus's threats seem trivial by comparison. "What if I refuse?" Runa asked. "What if I choose to seal the vault and walk away from all of this?" Magnus answered, with brutal honesty. "Then everything dies with you. The other guardians are aging, their children lost to the modern world's attractions. Without new leadership, Harald's legacy will crumble into legend within another generation." That night, alone in the trading hall that had become the center of a continent-spanning conspiracy, Runa tried to process the magnitude of what she had inherited. The quiet retirement she had sought had been an illusion from the beginning. Bjorn had chosen her precisely because her warrior's experience made her capable of making the hard decisions that restoration would require. The vault beneath her feet contained more than treasure. It held the dreams of a dead king and the hopes of scattered peoples who might never know how close they had come to reclaiming their heritage. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it also carried a strange appeal. For decades, she had fought other people's wars, served causes she barely understood, risked her life for gold and fleeting glory. Now she was being offered the chance to fight for something larger, the resurrection of a culture, the fulfillment of an ancient promise, the restoration of unity to peoples who had been divided for centuries. The decision would determine not just her own future, but the fate of Harald's legacy and the hopes of countless descendants who carried Norse blood in their veins. Tomorrow, she would need to give the Council of Guardians her answer. But tonight, she sat by the fire that warmed the hall, above a treasure that could reshape the world, and tried to decide whether she possessed the courage to accept a burden that had defeated every previous generation since Harald's kingdom fell. The letter's final lines echoed in her memory. "You are the culmination of our hopes, niece. The warriors and scholars and merchants who preceded you were all preparation for this moment. Choose wisely, for there will be no second chances." Outside, the mountain wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of winter and the promise of changes that would test everything she thought she knew about duty, honor, and the price of dreams that spanned centuries. Dawn brought more than just light to the valley. It brought visitors whose presence changed everything. From the north, south, and east, small groups of travelers converged on Eriksfjord, each party bearing the subtle signs that marked them as more than casual wanderers. Word of the council's gathering had spread through channels that had been carefully prepared over centuries. Runa stood at her window, watching the arrivals with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Her decision had been made during the long hours of darkness, but saying the words aloud would make them irreversible. Once she accepted the mantle of leadership, there would be no retreat to the peaceful obscurity she had originally sought. The council reconvened in the trading hall's main chamber, which now seemed far too small to contain the weight of their deliberations. Representatives from 12 guardian families filled the room, their faces bearing the marks of lives spent preserving secrets that few would ever understand. These were the inheritors of Harald's vision, the keepers of knowledge that could reshape the Norse world. "I accept the responsibility," Runa announced without preamble, But I will not lead this effort from shadows and whispers. If we are to restore what was lost, we must act openly and decisively." Lady Sigrid nodded approvingly. "Harold's time of hiding is over. The kingdoms have grown stable enough to survive the changes we will bring, and the Norse communities are scattered enough to benefit from reunification." Magnus produced a detailed map that had been hidden in his gear, its surface marked with locations that told the story of Harold's far-reaching preparations. 7 major treasure vaults, 13 smaller caches, and 47 archive sites scattered from Iceland to the Russian principalities. The resources exist to fund a complete restoration, but only if we can coordinate their use. The scope of Harold's planning continued to amaze Runa. He had anticipated not just the fall of his kingdom, but the centuries of division that would follow. His preparations had been designed to function across generations, maintained by families who passed the knowledge from parent to child like precious heirlooms. Eric Ironhand spoke for the weaponsmiths who would be needed to arm the restoration. The old techniques have been preserved, but the forges will need time to produce enough quality weapons. 6 months minimum for a proper warband, a year for anything larger. Ingrid Farwalker addressed the logistical challenges with merchants' practicality. Moving treasure and supplies across such distances without attracting attention will require careful coordination. We have ships and caravans prepared, but timing will be crucial. Thorvald Truthkeeper raised concerns about legitimacy and authority. The bloodlines exist to justify new rulers, but establishing their claims will require careful documentation and strategic alliances with existing powers. Each guardian brought specialized knowledge and resources, but also limitations that would constrain their efforts. The restoration could not be accomplished quickly or quietly. It would require years of careful work and the cooperation of peoples who had grown accustomed to division. "There is another consideration," Lady Sigrid said quietly. "Magnus was not the only treasure hunter seeking Harold's legacy. Others know of the vault's existence, some with resources that dwarf anything we can marshal." She produced intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture of competing interests. Foreign kingdoms that feared Norse reunification were funding expeditions to locate and destroy the treasure caches. Mercenary companies offered their services to anyone willing to pay for the elimination of guardian families. The secret that had been preserved for centuries was finally spreading beyond the control of those who had protected it. "How long do we have?" Runa asked. "Months, perhaps weeks," Magnus replied grimly. "My own search efforts attracted attention that I could not entirely conceal. Others will follow the same trails, ask the same questions, reach the same conclusions. The urgency transformed their planning from careful preparation to desperate improvisation. Centuries of patient waiting had condensed into a race against time, with the fate of Harold's legacy hanging in the balance. Einar spoke with the authority of age and long service. "Your uncle prepared for this possibility. Hidden in the vault's deepest chamber is something that could accelerate our timeline dramatically if you possess the courage to use it." That afternoon, Runa descended into the vault accompanied by the full council. The treasure chamber that had amazed her before now seemed almost mundane compared to what lay beyond it. Hidden passages led to deeper levels, each one revealing new aspects of Harold's incredible foresight. The final chamber took her breath away. Here, preserved in conditions that had protected them for centuries, lay the regalia of Harold's kingdom. Not just crowns and scepters, but the complete ceremonial apparatus needed to legitimize royal authority. Ancient law books, ceremonial weapons, sacred artifacts that had been blessed by the old gods themselves. At the chamber's center stood a stone pedestal bearing a warhammer of extraordinary craftsmanship. Its head was forged from meteoric iron, its handle carved from the heartwood of Yggdrasil itself, according to the runic inscriptions that covered its surface. This was Mjolnir's echo, the Guardian's warhammer, symbol of divine authority to rule and protect the Norse peoples. Harold's final gift, Lady Sigrid whispered. Whoever wields that hammer carries the legitimate authority to restore his kingdom. But the responsibility is absolute. Success or failure will determine the fate of every Norse soul for generations to come. Runa approached the pedestal with reverence that surprised her. She had handled many weapons in her warrior career, but none had carried such weight of expectation and consequence. The hammer's presence seemed to fill the chamber with potential energy, as if it waited for the right hand to unleash forces that had been building for centuries. "What exactly would restoration look like?" she asked. "What are we trying to achieve?" Thorvald answered, with the precision of a man who had spent decades studying the question. "Not conquest, but confederation. A voluntary alliance of Norse communities united by common culture, shared laws, and mutual protection." Harold envisioned a kingdom of the mind and spirit rather than simple territorial control. Magnus added his own perspective, shaped by generations of guilt and redemption. "My ancestor betrayed Harold because he feared the concentration of power in royal hands. The restoration must avoid that mistake. It must empower communities rather than subordinating them to central authority." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of their undertaking. They were not simply seeking to recreate Harold's original kingdom, but to build something new that incorporated the lessons learned from its destruction. The treasure would fund the effort, but the real challenge lay in convincing scattered peoples to embrace unity without sacrificing independence. As evening approached, reports arrived that confirmed their worst fears. Armed expeditions were moving towards several of the known vault locations. Some sought to claim the treasures for foreign masters, others aimed to destroy them entirely. The Guardians at 3 sites had already been forced to evacuate, taking what they could carry and abandoning centuries of careful preservation. "We cannot protect everything," Eric said bluntly. "If we attempt to defend all the sites, we will be too weak to defend any of them successfully." Runa felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like familiar armor. The strategic thinking that had kept her alive through countless battles now focused on a problem far larger than any she had previously faced. "Then we abandon the outlying caches and concentrate our resources on the most valuable sites," she decided. 7 locations maximum, the ones that contain irreplaceable artifacts or strategic necessities. Magnus nodded approvingly. A fighting withdrawal to defensible positions. Sound tactics, but it will mean sacrificing a substantial portion of Harold's legacy. "Better to preserve the heart than lose everything," Runa replied. "We can rebuild what we abandon, but we cannot resurrect what we allow to be destroyed." The council worked through the night, developing plans that balanced military necessity with political requirements. Messengers were dispatched to warn Guardian families at vulnerable locations. Supplies were gathered for what might become an extended siege. Alliances were activated that had remained dormant for generations. By dawn, they had transformed from a gathering of scholars and merchants into something resembling a military command structure. The trading hall that had sheltered Runa's hopes for peaceful retirement now served as the headquarters for a campaign that would determine the future of Norse civilization. As the council members prepared to depart for their various responsibilities, Lady Sigrid offered a final observation that crystallized the magnitude of their undertaking. "We are attempting something that has never been done before: the resurrection of a dead kingdom through the will of its scattered children. Success will require more than treasure and weapons. It will demand faith in a vision that most people have forgotten, and courage to pursue it despite overwhelming odds." Runa lifted the Guardian's warhammer from its pedestal, feeling its weight settle naturally into her hands. The weapon seemed to pulse with its own life, responding to her touch like a familiar friend rather than an ancient artifact. "Then we had better make certain we are worthy of the trust Harold placed in us," she said quietly. "Because failure will not just disappoint the dead, it will condemn the living to centuries more of division and weakness." The final battle for Harold's legacy was about to begin, and everything depended on whether a weary warrior could inspire scattered guardians to achieve what had seemed impossible for 7 centuries. The attack came at dusk, precisely when the defenders had hoped it would not. 3 separate forces converged on the valley simultaneously, their timing coordinated by someone who understood military tactics better than the common treasure hunters they had expected to face. Runa watched from the trading hall's upper window as torches appeared on the mountain paths. Too many torches, moving with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers rather than desperate fortune seekers. Her estimation of perhaps 20 attackers proved woefully inadequate as the true scale of the assault became clear. 200 men, maybe more, Magnus reported from his position at the eastern window. They've blocked all 3 mountain passes. Whoever planned this intended to ensure no one escapes to carry word of what happens here. The council members who remained in the valley had prepared for siege, but not for an assault of this magnitude. Their dozen guardians and handful of village allies were outnumbered 20 to 1 by enemies who possessed military equipment and training that spoke of foreign backing. Astrid burst through the hall's main door, her healer's calm replaced by urgent alarm. Henrik is organizing the villagers in the smithy. It's the most defensible building. But they have families, Runa, children who cannot fight and elders who cannot flee. The moral dimension of their situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Resistance would bring destruction not just to the guardians, but to innocent people whose only crime was living in a valley that harbored ancient secrets. Yet, surrender would accomplish nothing. These attackers had come to eliminate witnesses as well as claim treasure. The passage, Einar said quietly. The vault connects to old mine workings that emerge above the village. We could evacuate the non-combatants through the mountain's heart. Runa weighed options with the grim efficiency of someone who had made similar calculations many times before. The Guardian's warhammer felt heavy in her hands, not from its physical weight, but from the responsibility it represented. Every choice she made would echo through generations. Get the villagers into the mines, she decided. All of them fighters and families alike. We make our stand in the vault itself, where the enemy's numbers matter less than their courage. Magnus nodded approvingly. Sound tactics. The passages will force them to approach in small groups, and the sacred nature of the place might give some of them pause. The evacuation began immediately, guided by Olaf's knowledge of every path and passage in the mountains. Families streamed through the hidden entrance behind the fireplace, carrying what they could manage while abandoning homes that their ancestors had built over generations. Lady Sigrid coordinated the defense with the precision of someone accustomed to command. Thorvald, secure the genealogical records, they cannot be replaced. Eric, prepare whatever weapons we can manage. Ingrid, destroy anything that might reveal the locations of other vaults. As the last villagers disappeared into the mountain's depths, Runa found herself facing a decision that would define her legacy. The shield of truth lay among Harold's regalia, its bronze surface reflecting lamplight like captured fire. Legend claimed it would reveal the true nature of anyone who carried it into battle, their courage or cowardice, their honor or shame. She lifted the ancient shield, feeling its weight settle naturally against her arm. If this was to be her final battle, she would face it bearing the symbols of the authority she had accepted. The Guardian's warhammer in her right hand, the shield of truth on her left arm, the responsibility for Harold's legacy settled on her shoulders like invisible armor. The first attackers reached the hall just as the defenders completed their withdrawal to the vault. Runa watched through the concealed entrance as armed men systematically searched the building, their movements professional and thorough. These were not bandits seeking easy wealth, but soldiers following orders that came from someone with significant resources and clear objectives. Their leader appeared in the main chamber, his bearing confirming Runa's assessment of military training and foreign backing. He examined the fireplace with particular attention, running his hands along the stones, exactly as Magnus had done days earlier. "They know about the passage," Magnus whispered. "Someone provided them with detailed intelligence about the vault's location." The realization carried implications that chilled Runa's blood. A traitor existed among the Guardians, someone who had sold Harold's secrets to enemies, willing to commit mass murder to claim them. The centuries of careful secrecy had been compromised not by external investigation, but by internal betrayal. Sounds of excavation echoed from the main chamber as the attackers began dismantling the concealed entrance with tools they had brought, specifically for that purpose. Their preparation confirmed the presence of a knowledgeable informant, someone who understood not just the vault's existence, but the precise methods needed to access it. "How long until they break through?" Astrid asked. Eric examined the stonework with professional assessment. "Hours, not days. They know exactly which stones to remove and how to do it without bringing down the entire structure." The defenders used their remaining time to prepare positions among the treasure piles, turning Harold's legacy into fortifications for its own defense. Ancient weapons were distributed to hands that remembered their use, while sacred artifacts were moved to the vault's deepest chambers for protection. As the sounds of destruction grew louder above them, Runa realized that everything she had gained and lost in her long life had led to this moment. The shield of truth grew warm against her arm, responding to the approach of battle with its own ancient power. Whatever came next would test not just her courage, but the worthiness of Harold's dream itself. The breakthrough came with a grinding crash of stone that echoed through the vault like thunder. Torchlight flooded down the passage as armed figures poured through the opening, their advance slowing as they encountered the narrow confines that forced them into single file. Runa met the first attacker at the passage mouth, the Guardian's warhammer singing through the air with deadly precision. The man's sword shattered against the meteoric iron, and his cry of surprise became a gurgle as the return stroke crushed his chest. Ancient power flowed through the weapon, lending strength to arms that had grown weary with age and battle. Behind her, the other defenders formed a disciplined line among the treasure piles. Eric wielded a sword from Harold's armory, its blade holding edges that modern steel could not match. Magnus fought with twin axes that had been blessed by forgotten priests, their strikes leaving wounds that bled with unnatural persistence. But for every attacker that fell, two more pressed forward. The enemy commander had accepted that victory would cost lives, and his men advanced with the grim determination of soldiers who knew retreat meant death. Their foreign accents confirmed Runa's suspicions about outside backing. This was an invasion disguised as a treasure hunt. Lady Sigrid coordinated the defense with tactical brilliance, using the vault's geography to channel attackers into killing zones where superior numbers meant nothing. Ancient columns provided cover, while narrow passages created bottlenecks that turned the battle into a series of individual duels rather than mass combat. The Eastern Passage. Thorvald called out as new torchlight appeared from an unexpected direction. "They've found another entrance." The revelation that their enemies possessed detailed knowledge of the vault's layout confirmed the presence of a high-level traitor. Only someone with Guardian-level access could have provided such comprehensive intelligence about passages that had been secret for centuries. Runa fought her way toward the new threat, the shield of truth, blazing with bronze fire that seemed to confuse and disorient the attackers. Those who met her gaze in its reflection stumbled as if confronting truths about themselves they could not bear to acknowledge. The Eastern Passage disgorged a fresh wave of enemies, but their advance faltered as they encountered something unexpected. The Peace Stone, one of Harold's most sacred artifacts, lay directly in their path, and it had begun to glow with soft light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Ancient legends claimed the Peace Stone could only be activated by someone who chose unity over conquest, harmony over dominance. As the attackers approached, its light grew brighter, and something in their manner began to change. Weapons lowered slowly, faces lost their expressions of hatred and greed, and several men simply stopped fighting altogether. The enemy commander, recognizing the threat to his forces' morale, pushed forward personally to destroy the artifact. But as he raised his sword to strike the glowing stone, Magnus intercepted him with a blow that sent both men tumbling into the treasure chamber's center. "You're the traitor," Runa realized, watching Magnus struggle with the enemy leader. "You sold us out after all." But Magnus's response shattered her assumptions completely. "Not me," he gasped, blood flowing from a sword cut across his ribs. "Him." He pointed toward the passage entrance, where a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Einar stepped into the vault's light, no longer the frail elder who had served as their guide and counselor. His stooped shoulders straightened, his weathered hands gripped weapons with practiced ease, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had spent decades planning this moment. "The great irony," Einar said conversationally, surveying the battle around him. Harald's own guardians destroying his legacy because they could not see beyond their narrow vision of restoration. The revelation hit Runa like a physical blow. The man who had taught her about the vault's history, who had revealed the ancient oaths and explained Harald's vision, had been working to destroy everything he claimed to protect. "Why?" she asked, even as she prepared to face him in combat. Einar's smile held no warmth. "Because some dreams are too dangerous to fulfill. Norse reunification would upset the balance of power that has kept the kingdom stable for centuries. Better to destroy Harald's legacy than allow it to plunge the world into war." The peace stone's glow intensified as it responded to the confrontation between those who sought unity and those who feared it. Its light seemed to penetrate beyond surface intentions, revealing the deeper truths that motivated each person in the chamber. Under its influence, many of the attackers simply laid down their weapons and withdrew. They had come seeking gold, not war, and the stone's power stripped away the artificial hatred that had driven them to violence. But Einar and his closest followers were immune to its effects, their commitment to destruction too complete to be swayed by dreams of harmony. The final battle would be fought between those who believed in Harald's vision and those who would rather see it buried forever. Runa raised the Guardian's warhammer, feeling the weight of 7 centuries pressing down on this single moment. Everything that had been preserved, protected, and prepared for this restoration now hung in the balance of personal combat between Guardian and Betrayer. The peace stone pulsed with increasing brightness, waiting to see whether its light would illuminate victory or defeat for the dream of Norse unity. 6 months after the battle in the vault, Runa stood once again before the great fireplace of the trading hall. But everything had changed. The hearth that had once concealed ancient secrets now welcomed visitors from across the Norse lands, its warmth drawing together people who had been strangers for generations. The peace stone had done more than end the violence in Harald's treasure chamber. Its activation had sent ripples of influence across the mountains and beyond, touching the hearts of Norse communities that had forgotten their connections to each other. Word of the restoration spread not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple power of renewed hope. Magnus approached the fire, his movements still careful due to wounds that had not fully healed. The enemy commander who had tried to destroy the peace stone had fallen to his axes, but not before inflicting injuries that would mark him for life. Physical scars seemed a small price for the redemption he had finally achieved. "The delegation from Iceland arrives tomorrow," he reported. "That makes representatives from every major Norse settlement except the Greenland colonies, and even they have sent messages of support." The restoration had unfolded nothing like the military campaign Runa had initially envisioned. Instead of armies and conquest, it had become a gathering of peoples who remembered their common heritage and chose to embrace it once more. The treasure had funded not weapons, but schools, ships, and gathering halls where scattered communities could rediscover their connections. Astrid entered carrying the newest artifact to join. Harald's collection, a stone tablet carved with runic inscriptions that told a different story than those preserved in the vault. This was the new charter stone, created by consensus among the restored communities, establishing principles of governance that honored both unity and independence. "The final draft is complete," she announced, setting the tablet beside the fire. "Every community that wishes to join the Confederation will sign their agreement to these principles. No central authority beyond what they willingly accept, no obligations except mutual aid and cultural preservation. The charter represented everything. Harold's original kingdom had not been voluntary, flexible, respectful of local autonomy, while maintaining shared identity. The betrayal that had destroyed the first Norse unity had taught valuable lessons about the dangers of concentrated power. Lady Sigrid arrived as the afternoon light began to fade, her official robes replaced by the practical clothing of someone who had chosen service over ceremony. The royal magistrate had resigned her position to help coordinate the restoration, finding more purpose in building the future than preserving the past. Einar's surviving followers have been pardoned and released, she reported. Most were simply fearful of change rather than actively malicious. With their leader gone, they pose no further threat to our efforts. The old guardian's death in the vault had been swift and final. Faced with the Peace Stone's growing power and the collapse of his conspiracy, he had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The Guardian's warhammer had ended his life with a single stroke that seemed to carry the judgment of Harold himself. Henrik joined them as darkness settled over the valley, his forge finally silent after months of crafting tools for construction rather than weapons for war. The blacksmith had become the restoration's unofficial coordinator of practical matters, ensuring that grand visions translated into useful reality. The new trading posts are functioning well, he reported with satisfaction. Commerce is flowing along routes that have been abandoned for centuries. Norse craftsmen are rediscovering techniques they thought were lost forever. Olaf burst through the door with the enthusiasm of youth, discovering purpose larger than itself. The village chronicler had become the restoration's official historian, documenting every step of the process for future generations who would need to understand how unity had been achieved. The ship from Norway brought incredible news, he announced breathlessly. King Canute himself has recognized the Confederation as a legitimate political entity. We have official status within the existing kingdom structure. The recognition represented a diplomatic triumph that none of them had dared hope for. Rather than viewing the restoration as a threat, the southern kingdoms had embraced it as a stabilizing influence that could help manage the complexities of governing diverse populations across vast distances. As the fire settled into glowing coals, Runa reflected on the journey that had brought her from weary warrior to unlikely leader of a reborn civilization. The trading hall that had seemed like a refuge from responsibility had become the center of efforts that spanned continents and touched millions of lives. The treasure vault still existed beneath the floor, but its contents had been transformed from hidden wealth into working capital for reconstruction. Gold that had waited centuries in darkness now funded schools, ships, and settlements that brought light to communities that had survived in isolation for too long. "What comes next?" Magnus asked, echoing the question that occupied all their thoughts. Runa smiled, feeling a contentment she had not known since her youth. "We continue the work. We help scattered peoples remember their connections. We preserve what deserves preservation while allowing growth and change where they are needed." The restoration had succeeded beyond Harold's most optimistic dreams, not through the recreation of his original kingdom, but through the creation of something better, a voluntary confederation that honored the past while embracing the future. Outside, snow began to fall on the mountain valley, the same white covering that had protected the trading hall through countless winters. But now, the hall sheltered more than one family's dreams. It had become a symbol of hope for peoples who had rediscovered their heritage and chosen to build their future together. The fire crackled softly in the great hearth, its light reflecting off the new charter stone that would guide the Confederation through whatever challenges lay ahead. Somewhere in the vault below, the peace stone continued its gentle glow, a reminder that unity achieved through understanding was stronger than any bonds forged by conquest. Runa had found her peace at last, not in the solitude she had originally sought, but in the knowledge that her final battle had been fought for something worthy of the cost. Harold's dream lived on, transformed and renewed, ready to inspire another 7 centuries of hope.